We meet here today on the 168th anniversary of the Eureka Stockade at the site in which this historic event occurred. Eureka continues to intrigue and engage people. It has had a profound impact on Australian identity and the very character of our democracy. An important part of our annual Eureka commemorative program is the P Tobin Oration, and the late P Tobin OAM was passionate about Eureka and worked tirelessly to ensure it was remembered. At a time when interest in Eureka was in decline, he certainly kept its spirit alive. He worked tirelessly to advance the commemoration of Eureka, and throughout his time he was supported by his late wife, Faye. I'll now share with you an abridged version of a biography about P Tobin which was written by Ron Edberg. P Tobin was born in 1941. His father, Noel, had been a funeral director in Maryborough, but relocated to Ballarat to assist with the education of his children. After Peter left school, he worked for a short time with solicitors Burne Jones and Tawney, and then joined his father in the funeral business. Peter married his wife Faye in 1963. They had 4 children, Marie, Paula, Bernard and Michael, and had the privilege of working alongside Michael in the divisional van around Ballarat streets, many times as we were very junior constables very early in our police career. When Peter's father became ill, they relocated to the funeral premises in Dawson Street South, where they remained for 10 years. Peter, with his brother, also ran the Shoeing Forge service station on the corner of Dawson and Dana Streets. As well as being a prominent businessman in Ballarat, Peter also had a strong community-minded side. In 1979, Peter and Doug Sarah, together with a few others, formed the Eureka Commemorative Society to promote the significance of Eureka. The Society sought to correct the historical perspective and importance of Eureka, encourage discussion and debate, and to honour the Eureka legacy. To this end, it was thought appropriate that a recognisable monument should be built to honour Eureka, and hence the large flagpole at the Bakery Hill roundabout was erected to fly the Eureka flag to mark the 125th anniversary of Eureka in 1979. Peter was also a member of the Board of Directors of Sovereign Hill, having held the position of President. Peter said that a major highlight of his life was the privilege of assisting in the repatriation of the unknown Australian soldier from Villers-Bretonneux in France in November 1993. The soldier had died at the end of World War I, and Peter and Rob Allison from Allison Funerals were given the responsibility of ensuring the safe passage of the soldier's body from France back to Australia. Returning to his home country, the unknown soldier was interred in the Hall of Memory at the Australian War Memorial on Armistice Day, with a slouch hat, a sprig of wattle and soil from Pozieres battlefield. Peter's passion and commitment to Eureka and his work to ensure its respectful and important place in Ballarat and Australia's history culminated in the staging of the 140th anniversary of the Eureka Uprising. After it had successfully concluded, he said the Society had met all of its aims for the anniversary: arousing public interest, stimulating public debate, and helping restore the miners' and soldiers' graves in the old Ballarat cemetery. Peter said, "Eureka must rank in the history of this country as an event that has generated more myths and facts, legends and information, passion and disinterest than any other event." Sadly, Peter passed away on the 29th of March 2000, aged only 59, a tragic loss to Ballarat and the Eureka movement. His contribution to our community and the commemoration of the Eureka Stockade in particular is remembered annually through the P Tobin Oration. This year, the P Tobin Oration is presented by journalism scholar Dr. Josie Vine. Dr. Josie Vine has researched and taught in the RMIT journalism program since 2006. Josie's research and teaching focuses on the history and culture of modern Australian journalism. And after extensive research, Josie has traced the key historical episodes that have built professional Australian journalism's current collective values and beliefs. In her 2021 publication, Larrikins, Rebels and Journalistic Freedom in Australia, she identifies the Eureka Rebellion of 1854 as a defining event that continues to Australian journalism's understanding of its own democratic responsibility today, and will continue to do so into the future. Her latest book is Newspaper Building Design and Journalism Cultures in Australia and the UK, 1855 to 2010, co-authored with Salford University's Dr. Carol O'Reilly. Josie lives in Melbourne's western suburbs with her youngest child, said her older two have flown the nest, her partner, 2 dogs and 3 cats. And it is now my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Josie Vine to present the 2022 P Tobin Oration. Welcome, Josie.
Oh, good Lord, how did I get here? Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Before I start, I would first like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people on whose land I feel so honoured to be invited, and I'd like to recognise that this land has been for thousands and thousands of years before Eureka, was a place of storytelling, debate and discussion, and I feel so humbled to be able to stand here today and tell you a story. I would also like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands I live and work. I respectfully acknowledge the Indigenous peoples from all across Australia, traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across this great nation of ours. It's quite significant, the current debate about constitutional change in order to put the Uluru Statement from the Heart into our Constitution, because I'm going to be talking a lot today about the Constitution and its follies and foibles, if you like. The symbolic power of Eureka is well understood in our society. The word conjures images of the Australian democratic ideal that all citizens have a right to share power with those in authority, to participate in the running of a nation, to be involved in the decision-making of our democratic institutions, those that Edmund Burke called the estates, the legislative, those who make the law, the executive, those who enforce the law, and the judiciary, or those who administer justice according to the law. But what is less understood about Eureka is its cultural significance to the other estate, that one that society has much less understanding of, and I'm going to be talking a bit about that today. But it is equally as crucial to the running of our democracy as all the other estates. The so-called forgotten Fourth Estate. And it's this link between Eureka and our modern Fourth Estate as a democratic institution that I'll be talking about today. Now, first up, I'm going to be talking a fair bit about the Fourth Estate and what I mean by the Fourth Estate. And then I'm going to move on to how Eureka contributes to the Fourth Estate's understanding of its own function. So bear with me. This is an oration about Eureka, but the first little bit is going to be setting the scene of the Fourth Estate and the issues it faces in Australia specifically. The Fourth Estate is a slippery term, and people often don't quite understand what it means. It doesn't have the same official legitimacy as the legislative, executive, or the judiciary estates, particularly in Australia. But I'll get to that a little later. And yet it is still so key to our democratic functioning. When I talk of the Fourth Estate in modern terms, I mean journalism, and I'll talk a little bit about why I talk about journalism as opposed to the media in a moment. Because when I talk of journalism, I do not mean the media. When there is no trust in the media, we're not talking about no trust in journalism, because they're actually two completely different things. But it's so easy to get them mixed up or conflate the two in our modern digital world, because they actually look the same when they're not. Although many people use the terms interchangeably, journalism and the media are quite different. I like to explain it to my students, not that I consider you my students, but I like to think about the media as a big balloon, right? This is our modern public sphere, the media. And within that big balloon, there are lots of little balloons. Some of those balloons are, I don't know, soap opera, music, theatre. One of those balloons is the news media. That's still not journalism. Within that balloon that we call the news media is still lots of littler balloons, and some of those balloons are advertising, graphics, that kind of thing. One of those is journalism. Now, journalism is part of the media. There's no doubt about that. But all the other little balloons have a different set of values and beliefs. Their measure of success is audience numbers, entertaining, and of course money. Nothing wrong with that. I like making money. But journalism has a different measure of success. It still has to entertain, it still has to attract audiences, it still has to make money, but its measure of success is completely different. And that measure of success is how it represents us, the public, to all the other three estates. It expresses our concerns, how we want to change legislative processes, or how we want to change legislation. Because at the end of the day, it's us who runs the show in a democracy. And journalism's measure of success is how it not only represents us to the other three estates, but also how it facilitates and protects our freedom of access to information on the public sphere. That's its measure of success. I've said journalism also wants to make money, wants to protect the public's right to freedom of access of information. I'll get to how journalism does this in a bit, but for now, in order to understand my discussion, it's important to understand that journalism is not the media, or even the news media, but exists as a microculture within the wider media culture. It has its own microcultural practices, microcultural values, and microcultural beliefs, its own traditions, very important word for today's presentation, traditions, and professional fourth estate ideology. And what my research has found, actually, and when I say what my research has found, sorry, 50-year-old eyes don't work as good as what they did a couple of years ago. And what my work has found is that Eureka is a key moment in time, an event pivotal to the development of modern journalism's fourth estate ideology, that which I teach the young professional journalists of the future back at RMIT. Now, to actually explain this a little bit more, let's take it out of this high theoretical whatsy-doozy. Let's explain it in terms of how my interest in all of this started. In 2002, I began my career in this crazy thing called journalism academia, and if anybody's worked in academia, you understand what I mean by crazy. I had come from industry and was still absolutely committed to journalism and its objectives, but I had a small family, I had little kids, and I also happened to also be a single mother. And really, when you wake up at midnight and you hear an ambulance going up the highway, you can't just jump out of bed and chase that ambulance as a journalist does. Not with small children asleep in bed. So I thought going into journalism education would be able to kind of still allow me to achieve those objectives, but with more family-oriented hours. It was the same year that Natalie Larkins, an ABC journalist, was arrested out in the Dust Bowl of Woomera for failing to leave Commonwealth land as directed by a Commonwealth officer. But really, it was for being a pain in the arse to the authorities when Australian Protective Services officers told the swelling media contingent to move 200 metres away from the Woomera Detention Centre's fence, behind a temporarily erected fence. And the journalists there, from all over the world, all said, sure, no worries, we'll leave, but can you please tell us who's made the order and under what legislation? They couldn't get an answer. The officers didn't know. Behind the fence, not the temporary one, the permanent one, up to 70 of the world's most vulnerable people had gone on a hunger strike and, as a symbol of voicelessness, had quite literally sewn their lips together. And this is what the media was there. The media, sorry, we've said journalism isn't media. This is what the journalists were there to report on. Now, the government didn't want them to report on this. They didn't want journalists to give asylum seekers a human face at all. But they saw it as their fourth estate responsibility to get the story. The whole contingent of local, national and international journalists camping outside the centre wanted to know who had made the order for them to move and why. When the Australian Protective Services officers could not provide a clear answer, the journalists made a unanimous decision to remain inside the fence. The APS started gathering names and contact details to issue summons. Now, Natalie Larkins herself doesn't know why she was targeted to be arrested. She was the only journalist that day to be arrested. The APS started gathering names and contact details to issue summons. No one explained what the summons were for. Larkins was about to leave the disputed area, this is how she relayed the story to me, when an officer spoke. She didn't hear him and asked him to repeat the comment. At that point, she was arrested and taken to the Woomera police station. She was freed on bail 3 hours later, but was obliged to leave the town immediately. Despite the fact that at least a dozen other journalists refused to move from the camp's perimeter, Larkins was the sole arrest that day. She's gone on to, by the way, be a very successful journalism academic. So, this is kind of how much she's revered in these circles. When all this happened, I felt a gnawing sense of guilty envy. I wanted to be out there in the Dust Bowl of Woomera, refusing to move, getting arrested. The defiance and rebellion in an effort to gain access to people whose voice was being silenced. I wish I had been there, camping out in the heat and the swirling dust. But when I asked my students, 18-year-olds sitting in the comfortable confines of a university tutorial room, if they too would refuse orders to decamp, I was shocked and actually quite distraught. The answer was a unanimous no. They wouldn't defy an order from authority. Now, I was about to explain that as journalists, defying authority sometimes is part of your job, when I realised that I couldn't. How do you say that to an 18-year-old, young, respectable? How do you explain to well-educated, generally morally upstanding professionals, potential journalists, that as part of their job they may be required to openly defy the law? This then took me to a further thought. How do I tell them that to be good journalists, among the best professionals, they'll have to build affiliation with sources that include criminals, crooked law enforcers, drug addicts, or any number of downtrodden, dubious, and possibly dislikable characters? In a tertiary education environment, it can be a little uncomfortable explaining why it's so important to read that leaked document or listen to that anonymous source, despite the fact that it could, particularly in Australia, and I'll get to that in a minute, quite conceivably land them in dangerous legal waters. How do I tell them that? In a liberal democratic system, they may have to take such risks in order to fulfil their fourth estate democratic responsibility. Now, this is true of all journalism, all over the world. Journalism functions as an opposition to institutional authority, and so authority is compelled to put controls on journalists. Whether we're in a totalitarian or a democratic regime, the only difference is that in a totalitarian regime, it's quite overt. In a democratic regime, it's much more covert. It's never openly said. Australia, however, is a little different from everybody else. It is the only liberal Western society that does not officially recognise journalism as a key democratic institution, a fourth estate. Let me repeat that. Australia is the only liberal Western democracy in the world that does not recognise journalism as a democratic institution. What this means is that Australia is the only liberal Western democracy that does not provide overt legal protection for journalistic activity. We do not have freedom of speech in our Constitution. In fact, me just standing here is possibly against the law. In the US and Canada, there is a constitutionally guaranteed free speech and free press. US's First Amendment, first thing it did after the revolution, free press. European Convention on Human Rights has shaped the laws in every country in that continent. The United Kingdom has a Human Rights Act that mentions freedom of the press. New Zealand enshrined free expression and a free press at Section 14 of its Bill of Rights Act 1990. Australia has no legal protection. And yet, Australian society still expects its journalists to fulfil its democratic responsibility. There'd be absolutely outrage if journalists just walked along spouting the propaganda of those in authority, the politicians. There'd be outrage. They're still expected to fulfil this democratic responsibility fearlessly and without favour. This expectation was given substance in 1992 when the Australian High Court interpreted an implied right of freedom of political communication within the Constitution. This happened twice in 1992 and once in 1994, an implied right to freedom of political communication. This implied right, however, is very precarious. It can, at any moment, be repealed, as it was in 1997 by the High Court in the case between former New Zealand Prime Minister Lange and the ABC. The High Court said, sorry, you can't use this implied right of freedom of political communication in defamation cases. Very precarious situation. In other words, authority can, and when I say authority, I'm saying the highest authority, the High Court interpreting the Constitution, can at any time take away journalism's right to protect our liberty, not Rupert Murdoch's liberty, our liberty from authority, our right to freedom of access to information on the public sphere. So one wonders how Australia, apparently one of the world's most stable democracies, has managed to maintain this status with no recognised legal protection for journalistic freedom. At least part of this answer can be found in, and I hope I've remembered to put this in. Yes! At least part of the answer can be found in the 2005 comment made by the then Federal Secretary of the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, Christopher Warren, in Australia's inaugural Freedom of the Media report. I just want to say here, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance is Australian Journalism's professional association, and works tirelessly lobbying for our freedom, our right to access of information. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, but I'm telling you now, we wouldn't have the same right to access to information without this organisation. Just an aside. A free media, Christopher Warren said, never emerges as a gift. It needs to be fought for. It never attains a state of perfection, but rather sits on that fault line of power between government's desire for control and continuing pressure from society. Above all, it depends on the preparedness of the media itself to push back that line away from government regulation and towards a freer media. So let's hold that thought for a moment while we go back to my classroom in 2002, where not one potential journalist said they would refuse the order to decamp to further away from the Woomera detention facility's perimeter. In other words, not one showed the quite vital professional sensibility to fight, to push that line away from regulation towards a freer media. Now, if this quite vital journalistic sensibility is not official, if it isn't written on any textbook or in any professional code of conduct, there's only one aspect left about where it comes from, the Natalie Larkins of this world. It must be cultural. So let's think about culture and how it's constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed over generations. Central to this process is history. So I'm getting to Eureka now, folks. And the narratives that remember and celebrate certain moments in time. And we are here today celebrating one of those narratives so important to Australian culture generally. Now let's apply that same cultural theory to journalism, not to the media, remembering that media and journalism are separate things. Let's think about journalism as a social group, bound together by its own professional values and beliefs, its own fourth estate ideology. Let's start thinking about how this microculture's historical narratives perpetuate a fourth estate ideology. Now what we're talking about is heroes, villains, and how they are celebrated and remembered, the stories of which are passed from one generation to the next. Now I just want, before I get to Eureka, I've just got one more point to make. Incidentally, all Australian journalism microcultural heroes, those who are most celebrated within journalism, and there they are there, some, award winners, are also the most punished. Annika Smethurst has just spent months and months being threatened with charges of treason. Chris Masters, who broke the Rainbow Warrior story, who brought down the Bjelke-Petersen government, spent the whole decade of the 90s in court being sued for defamation for various stories. He calls 1990 his decade of defamation. Louise Milligan broke the story about George Pell. She spent days and days in the witness stand being absolutely attacked by the most aggressive lawyer in Australia, Robert Richter QC. Had her in tears in the stand. She still didn't reveal her source. Nick Mackenzie, most awarded journalist in Australia, wrote the story about Crown Casino, whose licence has now been called into question. Most awarded journalists in Australian history are also the most punished. When the best are the most punished, something isn't right. So let's just go back to my class of 2002 and my dilemma about how to teach a fourth estate culture in our future professional journalists, such as these. What I needed was a genealogy of journalism to show how this fourth estate culture is passed from one generation to the next. Not just any journalists, but those that are held up as the best throughout journalism history, through its pop cultural products. So things like the Melbourne Press Club Hall of Fame, the Walkley magazine, the Walkley Awards, the Quill Awards, those kind of cultural events for the profession. So I went on this journey to collate and tell the narratives of these heroes that together form a coherent microcultural journalistic fourth estate genealogy that tells this social group called journalists about professional values and beliefs, about their responsibility to, in the words of Christopher Warren, push back that line towards a freer media so we have a right of access to information on the public sphere. It was on this journey that I met Henry Earle and Clara Seekamp, key figures in the Eureka Rebellion of 1854 and pivotal figures in the genealogy of fourth estate journalism that I have spent the last, 20 years working on. We all know the story. The chain of events began in 1854 when Sir Charles Hotham, who had replaced Charles Joseph La Trobe as the newly formed Victorian Communities Governor, instituted twice weekly searches at the Ballarat gold digging camp that was already deeply dissatisfied with the licensing system and mired in poverty and disaffection with the British authorities' economic and civic mismanagement. After a botched investigation into the deaths of two diggers, one on the fields and another after a night of drinking, riots broke out at Ballarat's Eureka Hotel, followed by fighting at the makeshift Eureka Stockade. Every kid is taught this. After a battle that left 5 soldiers and 24 diggers dead, the Age, the Argus, even the Argus, the conservative thing that it was, the Age, the Argus, the Geelong Advertiser and the Ballarat Times condemned the administration as though with one voice. So all of a sudden, I'll talk a bit about why this was significant in a moment, but all of a sudden you've got the newspapers not behaving as the British authorities' publicity and propaganda, but they're behaving on behalf of the people, a real fourth estate action. But of course it was the local paper, the Ballarat Times, that acted as the real champion of the oppressed diggers. Editor Henry Earl Seekamp, don't you just love that name? Henry Earl Seekamp, a wonderful name, is remembered as one of the key animators of public opinion in the licensing debate. And his wife Clara is recorded as saying, "If Peter Lalor was the sword of the movement, my husband was the pen," although I don't think she spoke like that, but anyway, those were the words. My husband was the pen. As a result, Seekamp was charged with sedition along with his rebel compatriots. Now, I'm not too sure about the numbers, but out of the 14 rebels, I don't know if there were 14 rebels and Henry Earl, or if there were 13 rebels and Henry Earl. Anyway, out of the rebels, only the journalist was jailed. What was I saying about the best journalists being the most punished? Australian journalism culture constructs Henry Earl not as a criminal, but as a crusading spirit who martyred himself to protect freedom of the press against authority. The Melbourne Press Club Hall of Fame, for example, calls him the most famous and infamous journalist Victoria has so far known. The fiery English migrant established Ballarat's first newspaper, the Ballarat Times, and turned it into a clarion for the diggers in their protests at government corruption. Peter Mansfield, I don't know if anybody knows him, he's a Ballarat historian. Yes? He's not here today, is he? No? Oh, phew, phew. He said, Seekamp and other newspapermen ensured that the political background was much larger and subject to public scrutiny, a process we now take as a natural right, kind of indicating how important the Seekamps were. But Henry cannot be assessed alone. As we shall see, as a Fourth Estate prototype, he is incomplete without his wife Clara. When her husband was jailed for sedition, Clara had no qualms about taking on editorship of the Ballarat Times. And just by the way, she is the first female editor of an Australian newspaper that I can find. If somebody else knows a female editor before Clara, please let me know. It arguably an unauthoritarian act in itself in this quite intensely patriarchal era. Indeed, my fellow Eureka historian Rod Kirkpatrick suggests Clara readily took on an anti-authoritarian persona and quickly won notoriety for outspokenness against the restrictions imposed on the voices of the diggers. It is clear Clara would not allow the Ballarat Times to be cowed by the fact her husband was incarcerated. A Ballarat correspondent writing in the Argus, dated January 31st, reports that Mrs. Seekamp has published her manifesto, which was as startling in its tone and as energetic in its language, italics and capitals and free use of the words sedition, liberty and oppression. Although this correspondent was actually saying this to be derogatory of Clara's writing style, it actually came across as quite positive and has been held up as an example of how much Clara was admired at the time. But we'll go back to this letter in a moment to have a look at that it was actually quite derogatory. So let's have a little more look a little more closely at this couple and how they fit into our Fourth Estate genealogy of Australian journalism. Henry migrated from England to Australia in 1852 at the age of 23, so young man, just a baby really. He was among the first wave of migration of young optimists and rebels who saw in Australia an opportunity to build a new nation fit for free men. Their ideals were based on the radical Enlightenment philosophers, people like John Milton, John Stuart Mill, Locke. And they had already seen what a groundswell of collective action could achieve in the American Revolution. But first, they had to break the shackles of the British authorities, something that Henry Earle clearly saw as his responsibility as a newspaperman. The people have for once begun to feel their own strength, the first taste of liberty and self-government, he wrote on October 21st, 1854. Henry's idea of fourth estate responsibility was to agitate on behalf of the people, the oppressed people, and achieve quite radical civic reforms. But to do this, of course, he needed to be free from authority of the day. Now, let's just take a step back from Henry for a moment. By the time Australia was colonised, at the turn of the century, freedom of the press had already been recognised as instrumental to the Enlightenment movement's ideological commitment to political, social and economic reform. So in the United Kingdom, there was an emerging literate and relatively affluent audience, and they were demanding news through journals such as the London Times and Daniel Defoe. The Spectator, which apparently audaciously blazed a way for expansion of fresh independence and press independence in the UK. Of course, in the United States, a revolution had already been fought, at least in part, for Enlightenment ideals, including freedom of the press, which had emerged victorious in the Constitution's First Amendment, 1787. The Enlightenment and its legacy was marked by radical reform, where intellectual freedom, widespread education, individual rights to a public voice and participatory governance were strived for and even achieved. In the United Kingdom, United States, continental Europe, journalism was already developing as a profession to achieve these aims. It was already beginning to develop that legitimacy that is so needed. In Australia, however, there were unique problems. For a start, we were mainly populated by criminals who had forfeited their rights, such as freedom of speech. A mere 1,000 out of the 7,000 people were free citizens, so a newspaper could hardly be able to sustain itself financially. Isolation made news gathering and delivering of information very difficult, and the British authorities were terrified of revolution. So no freedom of the press in Australia. The first newspapers in Australia appeared in 1803, but they functioned as vehicles of publicity and propaganda for the British authorities. As such, they were heavily censored and even edited by the governor's own hand. Can you imagine that happening now? But in 1824, another hero of mine, Andrew Bent, an ex-convict printer of the Hobart Town Gazette, sacked his government-appointed editor, just kicked him out, and employed one of his own choosing, and started printing the Hobart Town Gazette without the governor's leave. The governor, Ralph Darling, was furious. He put Bent in jail and took over the Gazette offices. Bent sent his editor, so he's sitting in jail, he said to his editor, look, go to Sydney, tell him what Darling's done and tell him that he can't do it. So he sent his editor off to Sydney. Now, while he's in transit, two young British lawyers, William Wentworth and Robert Wardell, who had money enough to sneak their own printing press into Sydney from England, began publishing the Australian newspaper without telling anyone. Now, journalism historian Robin Walker argues that Wentworth and Wardell got away with not telling anyone about their newspaper because the newly instituted Legislative Council was not yet functioning. But I think it was because the British authorities were reluctant to put in jail two fine young upstanding Englishmen such as Wentworth and Wardell. Either way, doesn't matter. Once freedom of the press was granted to Wentworth and Wardell, it could hardly be denied to Bent in Tasmania, or any other newspaperman for that matter. So the upshot is, Australia achieved a free fourth estate press, not through any official decision, not through any written writing in the Constitution or anything like that. It was just through the anti-authoritarianism of an ex-con, Bent, and the audacity and cleverness of two British lawyers, Wentworth and Wardell. And it's this sense of defiance, audacity and risk-taking that the Seekamps inherited in their determination to agitate on behalf of the diggers in Ballarat. We know that Henry was a dapper little man, according to Raffaello Carboni, and only 25 when he established the Ballarat Times on Bakery Hill in 1824. He was a passionate reformist and appears to be very at home with the Ballarat Reform League and its accusations of government corruption. And he called for radical reform of the goldfields, civic administration, including votes for diggers. On November 18, he declared the Reform League to be the germ of independence, as in national independence, Australian independence from the British authorities. With such rhetoric, it's little wonder he was in the British authorities' sights as a troublemaker. The morning after the battle, police raided his newspaper offices, confiscated all copies of the Times, and arrested Seekamp for seditious libel. Apparently, this sedition was published on November 18th, November 25th and December 2nd. He was taken with his comrades to Melbourne to stand trial. He was the only one on a charge of seditious libel. The others were charged with high treason. But again, it's very telling that he was the only one to be jailed out of all the rebels. Again, always the journalist. It is without a doubt that Henry's penmanship was seditious. This is one of the bits that he was, one of the editorials he was jailed for. The Australian flag shall triumphantly wave in the sunshine of its own blue and peerless sky over thousands of Australia's adopted sons. And when the loud pain of now's the day and now's the hour, see the front of battle hour shall have pierced the blue vaults of Australia's matchless sky from the brave men of Ballarat next Wednesday at Bakery Hill. There will not be one discordant voice in the sublime and heroic chorus. Go forth, indomitable people, gain your rights, and may the God of creation smile down propitiously upon your glorious cause. Forward, people, forward. How could you not? How could you not? We know that Henry was a passionate reformist, but at trial, he adamantly denied penning the offending articles. He didn't write it, or indeed having any knowledge of their publication. At this point in time, he wrote to the Argus a letter saying that he most emphatically the articles were none of his production and was prepared to prove it in court. When he appeared for sentencing, Henry expressed regret that the articles had even been written. He's not sounding so revolutionary now, is he? In court, his counsel read two affidavits from his fellow compatriots George Dunmore Lane and John Manning. They stated it was they who had penned the offending articles. Seekamp had no idea he was travelling in Melbourne. In the end, Chief Justice Sir William of Becket grew impatient with the constant delays caused by Henry's denials, saying that no sane mind could doubt the grossly seditious character of the libels, and the editor of a newspaper should be responsible for its conduct. He sentenced Henry to 6 months, saying he had clothed himself with sedition so long as it paid, so long as he found it warm and comfortable. But when he found the garment intolerably hot, he dropped it. So, if Henry didn't write the articles, who did? Both Dunmore Lang and Peter Manning said it was they. But their eagerness to claim authorship kind of has the echoes of a crowd of gladiators claiming, "I am Spartacus." So I don't think it was them. It could have been Henry. He did claim to have an arts bachelor, but we never knew where from. Some unnamed university. He was certainly an idealist and a passionate revolutionary. But could he have organised a campaign of sedition through the pages of the Times as charged? One of the journalists, William Brammore Withers, said Seekamp was a little man and was often in trouble. He was said to write occasionally under inspiration from the source whence tradition tells us Dutchmen have drawn courage. We know from Kirkpatrick, my fellow journalism historian, that Henry died from excessive drinking in 1865, aged 35, although these dates are inconsistent with the Australian Dictionary of Biography's claim that Seekamp died in 1864, aged 45. The fact that he died from excessive alcoholism remains. In other words, he was very, very hot-headed, and his ire was fuelled by alcohol. So could he have written these amazing editorials? Maybe. But we also know he was fragile and unwell, and not a brilliant businessman. For example, we know it was Clara who doggedly petitioned the government seeking financial redress when the widening of the Melbourne Road removed 6 of Henry's properties. When asked why her husband did not front the committee, Clara replied, "My husband likes to write. I prefer direct action." Getting a bit of sense of who Clara is? After Clara and Henry went their separate ways, we know that Henry turned his hand to several other failed businesses, including another newspaper, and by 1862 he was offering lessons in French. Who knew he could speak French? Under the name of Monseigneur Henry Seekamp. Sorry if any French people here, I apologise for my terrible, terrible accent, attempted accent. Formerly professor at the Institut Châtelain, Paris. He may have gone back to prospecting at some stage because he died on the Claremont diggings, aged 35, from, and I quote, "natural causes accelerated by intemperance." For these reasons, I tend to agree with my fellow Eureka historian Claire Wright when she says it is more probable that the highly literate and intelligent Clara had her finger on the pulse and the pen of the newspaper issued from her house. And yet it is Henry, much more than Clara, who is celebrated within journalism microculture as an antecedent of a professional fourth estate ideology. Let's have a little think about Clara. Who she was when we start to seek some redress for her as an integral part of our fourth estate genealogy. Clara was an Irish-born actress a bohemian and, for her time, a thoroughly modern woman. She eloped with her dancing teacher, George Duval, at about age 13, as you do, and had 3 children to him. Now, no one knows whether her husband died or Clara was just called to Australia for adventure, but we do know she arrived in Melbourne with her 2 eldest children and no husband. In 1853. She claimed to be aged 20, but she was actually 34. She ran a theatrical company and worked as an actress in the area known as the Gravel Pits in Ballarat, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Less than a year later, she was Henry's de facto wife. There is no record of their marriage. She was also 10 years his senior. All very brash, self-assured moves for a woman of this era. Now, according to Claire Wright, Clara was, quote, highly literate and, quote, intelligent, and credits Clara for encouraging her fellow female firebrand, Ellen Young, to be published in the Ballarat Times. Now, Ellen's strident political poems and letters to the editor became a rallying point for Ballarat's collective grievances over the British administration. So she too was pivotal in rallying this kind of feeling of wanting to overturn a government. And if we listen to the writing that Clara does openly lay claim to in the Ballarat Times, it is remarkably similar in tone and style to the seditious, apparently anonymously written editorials that Henry went to jail for. In an outraged reaction to the blunt scapegoating tactics by Governor Hotham, i.e. only foreigners could possibly be responsible for the insurgents, Americans therefore had amnesty, or Americans had amnesty from being the foreigners responsible for the insurgents. Clara wrote, yeah, and who are these foreigners? Where are these foreigners? What is it that constitutes a foreigner? Oh, poor Governor Hotham, boo-hoo. Could you not have found some other truthful excuse for all the illegal and even murderous excesses committed by your soldiery and butchers? Why did you disregard our memorials and entreaties, our prayers and our cries for justice and protection against your unjust stewards here, until the people, sickened by hope deferred and maddened by continued and increased acts of oppression, were driven to take up arms in self-defence? Here we get a glimpse of Clara's personality. Not only is her writing insightful political analysis, but it is also strategically well-timed, written on New Year's Day, a time of symbolic rebirth and renewal, a new world. But we can also hear her disdain for Hotham's exemption of punishment for Americans, the very cohort that could, realistically, predict a Republican future and had already done so, experienced the practical success of rebellion in 1776. Unfortunately, most of the Ballarat Times editions edited by Clara are missing from the files. Now, I've gone searching for them, Kirkpatrick's gone searching for them, Claire Wright's gone searching for them, and Clara is quoted as saying, I wish I hadn't thrown my editions of the newspaper out. So if anybody knows where they are, do let me know. So this limits us to our interpretations of her journalistic style and leaving us to rely upon kind of second-hand sources. Neither do we have any photos of Clara or portraits. We have two of Henry Earle. One's a cartoon of him being horsewhipped by Lola Montez up the main street of Ballarat after he, gave her a critical review of her performance. And there's another one that Raffaella Carboni sketched of him, but you can't really see him. And we don't have any of Clara at all. This paucity of primary sources leaves us to rely upon secondary sources to interpret the significance of Clara to the Fourth Estate. In the patriarchal 19th century, Clara must have appeared as an ill-mannered, mouthy, and perhaps slightly hysterical woman who was insolently stepping out of her gender role. As such, the sources of her time are less than complimentary. William Westgarth, who was one of the journalists on the Times, said the community was, quote, amused by the, quote, violent style of Clara's leaders, while her husband was in jail. In the Geelong Advertiser, a journalist, the same one that I mentioned earlier in today's talk, begged for Henry's return to the editorial chair to, quote, relieve Ballarat from the, quote, dangerous influence of a, quote, free press petticoat government. Nice one. Charles Thatcher, a Goldfields balladeer, penned a ditty, which in part went, "S is for Seekamp, who I trust will be released upon my life. It will save us from the trash," inserted by his wife. Even in our more enlightened modern day, Clara's contribution to the Fourth Estate genealogy as Australia's first, she's Australia's first female editor, is overlooked. In the Melbourne Press Club Hall of Fame, Henry is lionised, while his wife is barely mentioned. Melbourne Press Club Hall of Fame says, Seekamp was the first Victorian journalist jailed over editorial principles and the only man to serve a prison term as a result of the Eureka Stockade. He was charged with seditious libel, jailed for 6 months and released after 3 months following a monster petition from the people of Ballarat. Sure, all true. But what it neglects to mention is that it was Clara who organised this monster petition and delivered it to Melbourne to get her husband out of jail. Not a mention. Rod Kirkpatrick, again, one of my esteemed journalism historian colleagues, describes Henry as, quote, a crusading editor angry on behalf of the suffering diggers up against the corrupt tools of a tyrannical government whose forthright editorialising ensured that agitation and the press were spoken of in the same breath, all Fourth Estate principles. Now, although Kirkpatrick recognises that Clara did take over editorship in Henry's absence and won publicity for outspokenness, she is otherwise overlooked. She's not even mentioned as the first female editor of an Australian publication. Claire Wright recognises Clara as a significant woman in the Eureka Rebellion, but not as a Fourth Estate journalist in her own right. Clara died of senile debility and heart failure in her Pascoe Vale home, aged 89. Her death certificate describes her occupation as a housewife. And yet, despite her legacy as a housewife, she was key in animating one of the most important events in our national identity. But of more importance to me and my interests, and to you as well, for your right to freedom of access to the public sphere and information on the public sphere, she is a significant figure in passing on the torch of the Fourth Estate ideology in the genealogy of Australian journalism. She certainly inspires me, and I hope by telling her story will inspire future journalists to protect our freedom of access to information on the public sphere in this country. And that's all I